So Jimmy Carter passed away earlier today at 100 years old. He was the 39th president of the United States and served from January 20th, 1977 to January 20th, 1981. There are now only 5 former presidents or current presidents alive, and that's Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and Biden. Now, Jimmy Carter's presidency is one of the most fascinating when it comes to foreign policy because it had such a broad spectrum across regions. It came during the post-Vietnam transition era, where the U.S. was finding its footing as the sole global superpower. It was a mix of successes and frustrating setbacks with lessons and challenges pertaining to global leadership. So as a foreign policy buff, I'm going to break down some of his legacy, for better or for worse. First, there was the Camp David Accords, probably Carter's biggest win on the world stage. In 1978, Carter brought Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin together for peace talks, and they actually worked. The result? Egypt became the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel, and Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Now, obviously, it didn't solve all of the Middle East's issues, as we still see problems to this day, but it was a monumental step forward and showed what patient diplomacy could achieve. It's still a cornerstone of Carter's legacy, and much of what he did serves as a blueprint for how future negotiations between Israel and Arab countries take place. Then there are the Panama Canal treaties, which have recently started making headlines with Donald Trump declaring that he wants the Panama Canal back under U.S. control. Now, this whole story started back in 1977 when Carter negotiated a deal to transfer control of the Panama Canal back to Panama by the end of 1999, which did happen. At the time, this was a hugely controversial issue for the U.S. A lot of people saw it as giving away American power, but globally it improved relations with Latin America, where resentment over U.S. dominance had been a big issue. Before this, many future Latin American allies were actually aligning with Russia. Carter took an approach based on fairness and respecting sovereignty, which earned him respect abroad, especially in South America, and it paid dividends for decades, even if it cost him politically at home. But not everything was smooth sailing for Carter. One of the biggest failures in his administration was the Iran hostage crisis, which frankly was a disaster. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. They were held for 444 days, and Carter couldn't secure their release before the end of his presidency. It eventually fell to Reagan to do so. To make things even worse, a rescue attempt called Operation Eagle Claw failed spectacularly, with equipment malfunctions and the tragic deaths of 8 U.S. servicemen. The whole ordeal made Carter look weak both domestically and internationally near the end of his term and likely contributed to his loss to Ronald Reagan. Carter was also instrumental in cooling tensions with the Soviet Union through the SALT II meetings. SALT stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, and this treaty looked to limit nuclear weapons. The deal was a step forward in arms control, but unfortunately it was never ratified by the Senate because in 1979 the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. That invasion marked the end of the détente policy, or what is known as the easing of relations between the Soviet Union and the US, because it forced Carter to pivot hard, and he imposed sanctions as well as boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. This also began a period of increased military spending, which eventually contributed to the economic strain that led to the Soviet Union's downfall. Finally, I would be remiss to not discuss his focus on human rights. His approach as president was both groundbreaking and complicated. Carter put human rights at the center of U.S. foreign policy, which as president was largely the first time we've ever seen that. He openly criticized authoritarian regimes, especially in Latin America. He took strong stances against apartheid in South Africa by withdrawing U.S. investments from governments that supported racial segregation. He cut aid to Nicaragua due to the brutality of the Somoza regime. He also took Iran to task for civil rights abuses under the Shah, although he continued arms sales despite the regime's oppressive practices. Additionally, he consistently brought Soviet human rights abuses to international bodies like the UN. All of this marked a significant shift from past administrations, which tended to turn a blind eye to abuses for the sake of maintaining alliances. That said, Carter wasn't always consistent. He worked with countries like Saudi Arabia, even though they were and continue to be human rights abusers. This policy remained intact for many countries where the U.S. had strategic interests. His messaging was strong, but his application was watered down. So when you look at Carter's foreign policy, you see a leader who genuinely tried to make the world better, sometimes succeeding brilliantly and other times falling short. He brokered peace where it seemed impossible, but he also struggled with crises that highlighted the limits of diplomacy. It's a legacy of idealism and pragmatism, and it's a constant reminder of just how complex being the leader of the free world can be.